August 13th, 1945. 48 hours before the deadliest war in human history ended, a 26-year-old kid from East Los Angeles, who used to stack milk crates for a living, pointed the nose of a 7-ton American fighter straight at 9 Japanese warplanes and squeezed the trigger. He had 0 confirmed kills. He had flown 9 missions that produced nothing but empty skies and wasted fuel. Every pilot in his squadron had written him off as a man who would finish the war without ever firing a shot in anger. In the next 120 seconds, Oscar Perdomo would destroy more enemy aircraft than most fighter aces accumulated in an entire year of combat. His gun camera would capture every single frame. And the story of how a nobody became the last ace in a day in United States military history would begin with a sound that no Japanese pilot over Korea expected to hear. That morning, the simultaneous roar of 850 caliber Browning machine guns tearing the sky apart at 4,000 rounds per minute. But before we get to the killing, you need to understand why Oscar Perdomo should never have been in that cockpit in the first place. By the summer of 1945, the war in the Pacific had become a nightmare of mathematics. American forces were island-hopping toward the Japanese homeland, and every island cost more blood than the last. Iwo Jima had killed nearly 7,000 Marines. Okinawa was worse. 12,000 Americans dead, another 36,000 wounded, and that was just one island. Military planners were staring at Operation Downfall, the proposed invasion of mainland Japan, and the casualty projections made grown men sick. Conservative estimates predicted 1 million Allied casualties. Some analysts doubled that number. The Japanese had mobilized their entire civilian population. Women trained with bamboo spears. Teenagers learned to strap explosives to their bodies and throw themselves under American tanks. Every man, woman, and child on the home islands had been told that death was preferable to surrender. The kamikazes had already proven that Japanese pilots would fly their aircraft directly into American warships without hesitation. At Okinawa alone, nearly 2,000 kamikaze attacks had sunk or damaged over 300 Allied vessels. The United States Navy lost more sailors at Okinawa than in every other naval engagement of the Pacific War combined. And that was just the beginning of what Japan had planned. The Imperial Army had hidden thousands of aircraft in caves, tunnels, and underground hangars across the home islands. They were saving everything for the invasion. Every fighter, every bomber, every rickety trainer that could carry a bomb was being hoarded for one massive final kamikaze assault designed to destroy the American invasion fleet before it could land a single soldier on Japanese soil. Intelligence officers estimated between 5,000 and 10,000 aircraft were waiting. The skies over Japan would become a slaughterhouse. American pilots flying escort and air superiority missions knew exactly what that meant. Most of them would not survive the first week. The men of the 57th Fighter Group, stationed on Ie-shima, a tiny coral island 4 miles off the northwest coast of Okinawa, understood the math better than anyone. They flew P-47 and Thunderbolts, the newest and most powerful variant of Republic Aviation's legendary fighter. They had the range to reach Japan. They had the firepower to destroy anything in the sky. What they did not have were targets. For 6 straight weeks, the 57th had launched mission after mission into empty air. Escort runs where no enemy appeared. Strafing attacks on airfields where every Japanese plane sat hidden underground. The pilots joked bitterly that they were the most heavily armed taxi service in the Pacific. Somewhere down there, thousands of Japanese aircraft waited in darkness. But nobody could find them. Nobody could force them to fight. And then there was Oscar Perdomo. Nobody in the 57th expected much from the quiet kid with the strange nose art. Oscar Francis Perdomo was born in 1919 in East Los Angeles to a family that had crossed the border from Mexico with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a story that sounded like a fever dream. His father had ridden with Pancho Villa during the Mexican Revolution, a genuine revolutionary cavalryman who had traded bullets and bloodshed south of the border for the grinding poverty of immigrant life in California. The family settled in the barrios of East LA, where Oscar grew up speaking Spanish at home and English in school, learning to fix things with his hands, because his family could not afford to replace anything that broke. He was not a scholar. He was not wealthy. He was not connected. Before the war, Oscar Perdomo worked at the Pacific Milk Crate Company, stacking wooden crates in a warehouse for wages that barely covered rent. The kind of job that nobody notices and nobody remembers. The kind of man that history walks past without a second glance. Pearl Harbor changed everything. Perdomo enlisted qualified for flight training and discovered something extraordinary about himself. The kid from the milk crate factory could fly. Not just fly, but fly with the kind of natural instinct that instructors whispered about in private. His hands found the controls the way a musician's fingers find the keys. Stick and rudder felt like extensions of his own body. He earned his wings, received his commission as a second lieutenant, and waited for assignment to a combat unit. The assignment came in the spring of 1945, when the war had less than 6 months to live, though nobody knew it yet. Perdomo joined the 57th Fighter Group and shipped out to Ieshima, where he found himself strapped into the cockpit of a machine that was pound for pound the most devastating single-engine fighter aircraft ever built. The P-47 Thunderbolt was not graceful. It was not elegant. It was a monster. Republic Aviation had taken their already massive Thunderbolt design and made it bigger, heavier, and meaner, specifically for the vast distances of the Pacific Theater. The wings were redesigned with internal fuel tanks that carried 93 gallons in each wing root. Fully loaded with external drop tanks, the aircraft could haul over 1,200 gallons of high-octane aviation fuel, giving it a combat radius that could reach Japan and return. The engine was a Pratt & Whitney R. 2800 double wasp and 18-cylinder radial that produced 2,800 horsepower and could push the nearly 20,000-pound fighter past 460 miles per hour in level flight. In a dive, the P-47N approached speeds that would not be matched until the jet age. But the real terror of the Thunderbolt was its armament. 8 M2 Browning 50 caliber machine guns mounted in the wings, fed by 3,400 rounds of ammunition. When a Thunderbolt pilot pressed his trigger, those 8 guns unleashed a combined rate of fire that could shred an enemy aircraft in less than 2 seconds. Pilots called it the buzzsaw. Ground crews called it the meat grinder. Oscar Perdomo called his aircraft something else entirely. He named it Lil Mayo's Meat Chopper. The nose art showed a baby sitting in a diaper, chomping an oversized cigar, wearing a derby hat tilted at a rakish angle, and clutching a tiny rifle in its pudgy hands. The baby was his son Kenneth Bourne, while Perdomo was in training, waiting back home in Los Angeles, with his mother too young to understand that his father was flying toward a war that killed men every single day. That ridiculous, beautiful, heartbreaking little painting on the nose of a 7-ton killing machine was Oscar Perdomo's promise to himself. He was coming home. He was going to see that boy grow up. No matter what the sky threw at him, the baby on the nose of Lil Mayo's Meat Chopper was going to see his father walk through the front door alive. 9 missions produced nothing. 9 times Perdomo strapped in, flew out burned fuel, and came home without firing a single round. His gun ports stayed clean. His ammunition counters never moved. The crew chief would check the wings after every landing and shake his head. Nothing. Again. Other pilots had at least strafed ground targets. Perdomo could not even claim that. The Japanese were invisible. Their aircraft hid underground while American Thunderbolts circled overhead like hawks searching for prey that refused to emerge. Intelligence briefings repeated the same information week after week. The enemy is hoarding. The enemy is waiting. The enemy will appear when the invasion begins, and when they do, there will be so many of them that the sky will turn dark. Encouraging words for a pilot who had never seen a hostile aircraft outside of recognition training slides. And then came August 13, 1945, and everything Oscar Perdomo believed about himself, everything his squadron believed about him, everything the war had taught him about patience and empty skies, was about to be obliterated in the most violent 6 minutes of aerial combat fought in the final month of World War II. Mission 507-35 launched 53 Thunderbolts from Aishima at dawn. 15 turned back with mechanical failures or navigation problems. The remaining 38 droned northwest across the East China Sea, crossed the Korean coastline, and approached the city of Keijo. The mission profile called for 8 hours of flying 1,500 miles round trip, most of it over open water, where a single engine failure meant a slow death in the Pacific. Every pilot understood the stakes. Fuel management was not a suggestion. It was survival. Then the radar screens lit up. Not a few contacts, not a scattered patrol. Dozens of enemy aircraft climbing to meet them. The Japanese 22nd and 85th Sentais had scrambled everything they possessed. Nakajima Ki 84. Hayate fighters. The aircraft Allied intelligence designated Frank Japan's best and most dangerous interceptor. Nakajima Ki 43 Oscars, lighter and more agile. Even a pair of Yokosuka K-5Y Willow biplanes canvas-covered training relics that had no business being anywhere near a combat zone. 50-plus Japanese aircraft rising to meet 38 American Thunderbolts. The numbers favored the enemy. The element of surprise favored the enemy. For the first time in 6 weeks, the Japanese had decided to fight. And they had chosen to fight with everything they had. Oscar Perdomo looked down from 12,000 feet and saw 5 enemy fighters breaking formation below him. 3 trailed the main group. 2 more flew in a loose pair to the east. His heart hammered. His hands tightened on the stick. 9 missions of nothing, and now the entire Japanese Air Force had appeared beneath his wings, like a nightmare made real. He pushed the throttle forward. The Pratt & Whitney engine surged with 2,800 horsepower. The Thunderbolt's nose dipped toward the earth. Wind noise increased from a hum to a scream. The airspeed indicator climbed past 300, past 350, past 400 miles per hour. 8,000 feet of altitude separating him from the enemy dissolved in seconds. Oscar Perdomo centered his gun sight on the trailing Ki 84 and placed his finger on the trigger. The baby on the nose of his aircraft grinned its painted grin. The cigar pointed forward like a tiny cannon. The meat chopper was about to earn its name. But what happened next was not just a dogfight. What happened in the skies over Korea that morning was something that the United States military would study, document, and ultimately classify as one of the most extraordinary individual aerial combat performances of the entire Pacific War. A milk crate stacker from East Los Angeles was about to do something that fewer than 50 pilots in American history had ever accomplished, and he was going to do it with a level of violence and precision that left intelligence officers speechless when they reviewed the gun camera footage. 5 enemy aircraft would fall in flames. 3,000 rounds of ammunition would be expended in less than 6 minutes. And when the guns finally went silent, when every single belt was empty and every single barrel was smoking, Oscar Perdomo would do the one thing that nobody could have predicted. He would charge a 6th enemy fighter with absolutely 0 rounds remaining. That story, the full, unbelievable documented account of what Lil Mayo's meat chopper did on August 13, 1945, begins right now in Part 2. A milk crate stacker from East Los Angeles with 0 confirmed kills had just pushed his 7-ton Thunderbolt into a screaming dive toward 5 Japanese fighters over Korea. 8 .50 caliber machine guns loaded. 3,000 rounds of ammunition ready. And exactly 4 minutes before every single belt ran dry. That is where we left Oscar Perdomo at the end of Part 1. But shooting down enemy aircraft was only half the battle that morning. Getting home alive across 750 miles of open ocean with empty guns, empty tanks, and an enemy who wanted him dead would prove just as dangerous as the combat itself. The kill ratio for the mission would stun intelligence officers. The fuel calculations would terrify every pilot in the formation. And the decision Oscar Perdomo made after his ammunition ran out would become the single most reckless act of courage documented by gun camera footage in the final month of World War II. The first burst changed everything. Perdomo closed to 800 yards behind the trailing P-47. Frank centered his gun sight on the junction of engine cowling and cockpit and pressed the trigger. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. 8 Browning machine guns firing simultaneously produced a cone of destruction that no aircraft on Earth could survive at that range. 50 caliber armor-piercing incendiary rounds tore through aluminum skin, shattered the engine block, and ignited fuel lines in a fraction of a second. The P-47 shuddered, as if a giant hand had slapped it from the sky. Black smoke erupted from the cowling. The propeller seized, and the Japanese fighter began a slow, sickening spiral toward the Korean countryside, 8,000 feet below. Perdomo did not watch it fall. He was already shifting his gun sight to the second aircraft. The trailing pair of Ki-84s had been flying close formation, which meant the wingman was less than 200 yards from his now burning leader. The Japanese pilot saw his companion explode and tried to break right. Too slow, too late. The mathematics of aerial combat are simple and merciless. Speed plus firepower plus position equals destruction. There is no negotiation. There is no second chance. Perdomo followed the brake with a slight adjustment of his rudder pedals, keeping the enemy fighter centered in his gun sight for less than 3 seconds. That was more than enough. The second Ki-84 took hits across its entire fuselage from nose to tail. Pieces separated from the airframe. A section of wing tumbled away, spinning like a playing card thrown into the wind. The tail assembly disintegrated. Then the fuel tanks caught, and the fighter became a fireball, a tumbling comet of orange flame and black smoke falling toward Earth. 2 kills in less than 60 seconds. Oscar Perdomo, the man with 9 empty missions, the pilot nobody expected anything from, had just destroyed 2 of Japan's best fighters in the time it takes to tie your shoes. The third Japanese pilot in the trailing group had seen enough. He rolled inverted and dove for the deck, accelerating away from the American, who had just killed both his wingmen in under a minute. Perdomo let him go. Chasing a single fleeing enemy meant losing sight of the larger battle, and the sky over Korea had erupted into absolute chaos. 37 other American Thunderbolts were tangled with 50-plus Japanese aircraft across 50 miles of airspace. Smoke trails crisscrossed the sky. At least 3 parachutes drifted below, though Perdomo could not tell whether they carried American or Japanese pilots. He pulled the P-47N into a climbing turn, scanning for friendly aircraft, checking his fuel gauges, counting the minutes that separated him from the long flight home. Every minute of combat burned fuel at 3 times the cruise rate. The external tanks had been dropped before the engagement. He was running on internal fuel only. The return flight to Ieshima would take nearly 4 hours. The numbers worked, but barely. Then he spotted movement at 800 feet. 2 aircraft flying in close formation. Biplanes. Canvas-covered relics from another era. Yokosuka K-5Y Willows, Japanese training aircraft with a maximum speed of 132 miles per hour, slower than most automobiles on an American highway. What they were doing in the middle of the largest air battle over Korea made no tactical sense. They wore Japanese markings. They were legitimate targets. Perdomo rolled inverted and dove. The P-47N was screaming past 400 miles per hour when he opened fire on the closer biplane. The engagement lasted approximately 3 seconds. The Willow caught fire, spiraled right, and impacted the ground in a column of black smoke. 3 kills. The second Willow disappeared into a cloud bank before Perdomo could find it. He pulled up, checked his ammunition counters, and felt the first chill of mathematical reality. 3 kills had consumed nearly half his total ammunition. 1,500 rounds remained. The meat chopper still had teeth, but they were getting shorter with every trigger pull. He climbed above the clouds, searching for friendly aircraft. What he found instead were 4 Japanese fighters setting up a textbook ambush. 4 Ki-84 Franks held the altitude advantage. They had the sun behind them. They had speed building in a shallow dive. They had positioned themselves in the exact formation that Japanese instructors taught for killing American pilots. High fast sun at your back target, unaware below. It was the bounce that had killed hundreds of Allied pilots over the Pacific. Perdomo saw them at the last possible moment. 4 shapes diving out of the solar glare, growing larger with terrifying speed. He had perhaps 2 seconds to make a decision that would determine whether his son Kenneth ever saw his father again. He did not run. Running from a diving fighter meant exposing your engine and cockpit to concentrated fire from behind. The P-47N was tough-built like a flying tank, with armor plating and self-sealing fuel tanks, but no aircraft could survive 4 enemy fighters pouring rounds into it simultaneously. Instead, Oscar Perdomo did something that violated every instinct a fighter pilot possesses. He turned directly into the attack. Nose high, speed bleeding away, climbing straight toward 4 armed enemies who were diving to kill him. The maneuver was either brilliant or suicidal. For a frozen instant, it was impossible to tell which. The Japanese formation had expected the American to dive or break away. Every calculation they had made, every angle they had set up, was based on a fleeing target. Instead, the Thunderbolt was coming straight at them. All 4 Ki-84 pilots had to adjust their aim simultaneously. That moment of confusion, that single heartbeat of recalculation, was all Oscar Perdomo needed. He rolled the P-47N onto its back and pulled hard, reversing direction in a split S that sent the Thunderbolt plunging earthward while the 4 Japanese fighters overshot above him. Their diving speed carried them past and below his new position. The geometry of the engagement had flipped completely. The hunters were now the hunted. Perdomo selected the trailing Ki-84, the one whose pilot was still trying to understand what had just happened, and opened fire. 50 caliber rounds tore through the engine cowling from a range so close that Perdomo could see the individual panels of the Japanese aircraft's skin rippling under the impact. The Ki-84 exploded in a ball of orange flame so violent that burning debris pelted the underside of Perdomo's Thunderbolt as he flew through the wreckage. 4 kills. Oscar Perdomo was an ace. Not over months of grueling combat. Not through dozens of carefully planned missions. In a single engagement lasting less than 5 minutes. The remaining 3 Ki-84s scattered in 3 different directions. One dove for the deck. One climbed toward the clouds. The third tried to circle back. Perdomo ignored them all. His ammunition counters showed numbers that made his stomach drop. Perhaps 30 seconds of firing time remained, maybe less. He needed to find his squadron. He needed to begin the 4-hour flight home. The war could continue without him. Then he saw something that changed the calculation entirely. A single Ki-84 had latched onto the tail of an American Thunderbolt and refused to let go. The P-47N pilot was jinking desperately, throwing his aircraft through violent evasive maneuvers, but the Japanese fighter matched every move. A second American Thunderbolt was trying to help, but every time the wingman lined up a shot, his squadron mate flew into the line of fire. The geometry was wrong. The angles would not work. And the Japanese pilot was seconds away from putting a killing burst into the American cockpit. Oscar Perdomo had perhaps 20 seconds of ammunition remaining, maybe less. He was 750 miles from home. His fuel gauges demanded that he leave immediately. Every rational calculation, every mathematical truth, every survival instinct screamed at him to turn southeast and fly for Ieshima. He pushed the throttle to maximum power and dove toward the engagement. The meat chopper had one last bite. The Ki-84 pilot was focused entirely on his target, watching the American Thunderbolt fill his gun sight, waiting for the perfect moment to fire. He never checked his 6 o'clock. He never saw Perdomo diving toward him at 400 miles per hour from directly above and behind. Perdomo pressed the trigger and held it down. Tracers reached across the sky. Hits sparkled along the Ki-84's fuselage. Smoke erupted from the engine. Then silence. Not a gradual slowdown. Not a few final rounds stuttering from the barrels. Complete silence. All 8 Browning machine guns went dry simultaneously. 3,000 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition, enough firepower to level a small building, had been expended in less than 6 minutes of combat. The Ki-84 was damaged. Smoke poured from its engine. But the aircraft was still flying, still under control. And now the Japanese pilot knew he was under attack from a new direction. He broke off his pursuit of the American Thunderbolt and turned toward Perdomo with his guns loaded and his intentions clear. Oscar Perdomo was now alone in hostile airspace, 750 miles from home, with a wounded enemy fighter turning to kill him and exactly 0 rounds of ammunition remaining. What he did next defied every rule of aerial combat ever written. He did not run. He turned into the Ki-84, nose to nose. An unarmed American fighter charging directly at an armed Japanese warplane at a combined closing speed of nearly 800 miles per hour. The Japanese pilot could not know that the Thunderbolt's guns were empty. All he could see was an American fighter boring in with apparent killing intent, 8 gun ports pointed directly at his cockpit. Aerial chicken. The deadliest game in the sky. The Ki-84 pilot flinched first. With his engine trailing smoke and this apparently armed maniac coming straight at him, he broke right and dove away. Perdomo followed, turning inside the Japanese fighter, maintaining the illusion of an offensive posture, pointing empty guns at an enemy who believed each second could be his last. He keyed his radio, called for help. Somewhere in the chaos, an American pilot heard the transmission. The response was immediate. Perdomo continued his deadly bluff turn and counter-turn dive and climb. Empty barrels tracking the Ki-84, through every maneuver forcing the Japanese pilot to react defensively to a threat that did not exist. The deception could not last forever. Eventually, the enemy would realize no tracers were coming. Eventually, he would understand he was running from an empty hand. Help arrived before that moment came. A second P-47N dropped out of the clouds at full power, positioned perfectly, and opened fire. 8 .50 caliber machine guns caught the Ki-84 from above and behind. The Japanese fighter disintegrated. Wings separated from fuselage. The engine tore free. Burning debris scattered across the Korean sky. 5 kills. Oscar Perdomo had just become the last ace in a day in United States military history. Intelligence officers would review the gun camera footage and confirm every single one. The film captured the first 4 kills in brutal clarity. It documented the absurd Willow biplane. And it showed the 5th engagement the damaged Ki-84 that Perdomo had attacked, chased and bluffed with empty guns until his squadron mate delivered the killing blow. The credit went to Perdomo because without his initial attack, the Ki-84 would have destroyed the American it was pursuing. Without his pursuit, the damaged fighter would have escaped. Without his willingness to charge an armed enemy with an empty aircraft, there would have been no 5th kill at all, but the celebration would have to wait. Oscar Perdomo was still 750 miles from home. His fuel gauges showed numbers that turned survival into an arithmetic problem with a very narrow margin for error. The external tanks were gone. Every minute of combat had burned fuel at triple the cruise rate. The remaining 38 Thunderbolts of the 57th Fighter Group began reassembling over the Korean coastline, some trailing smoke, others showing visible battle damage. All of them facing the same brutal equation, 4 hours of open ocean, with no landmarks, no emergency airfields, and no rescue ships along the route. 20 Japanese aircraft had fallen to American guns that morning. The 57th had lost 0. It was the kind of kill ratio that earned presidential unit citations. But citations meant nothing if you ran out of fuel over the East China Sea. Perdomo trimmed his aircraft for maximum efficiency, adjusted his throttle and mixture to squeeze every possible mile from his remaining fuel, and pointed the nose of Lil Mayo's meat chopper toward a tiny coral island 4 hours southeast. The baby on the nose grinned its painted grin cigar-clenched derby hat, tilted oblivious to the fact that its father had just accomplished something that would never be repeated in the history of American military aviation. The ocean stretched ahead, endless and indifferent. And Oscar Perdomo did not yet know that the war was 48 hours from ending. He did not know that Emperor Hirohito had already made his decision. He did not know that the invasion would never happen, that the millions of projected casualties would never materialize. That August 13, 1945, was one of the final days it was even possible to become an ace. He knew only that the fuel gauge was dropping, the ocean was vast, and home was very, very far away. The meat chopper had earned its name. Now it had to survive the journey back. And what waited for Oscar Perdomo after the war? The medals, the peacetime service, the Second War in Korea, and the tragedy that would ultimately destroy the man who could not be destroyed in combat. That story was still decades away. The sky over Korea fell silent. The guns were empty. The fuel was low. And the longest 4 hours of Oscar Perdomo's life had just begun. A milk crate stacker from East Los Angeles flew 9 missions without firing a shot. On his 10th, he destroyed 5 Japanese aircraft in 6 minutes, became the last ace in a day in American history, and then charged an armed enemy fighter with 0 rounds of ammunition. When we left Oscar Perdomo at the end of Part 2, he was 750 miles from home, fuel gauges dropping toward empty, flying over an ocean that killed pilots as efficiently as any enemy. 20 Japanese aircraft had fallen to American guns that morning. The 57th Fighter Group had lost none. But the war was not over. The sky over Korea had gone quiet, but the longest 4 hours of Oscar Perdomo's life were just beginning. And what waited for him on the other side of that ocean, the confirmation, the medals, the Second War, and the tragedy that no amount of courage could prevent, would prove that surviving combat was only the first chapter of a story that history almost forgot. The East China Sea stretched beneath the formation like a gray-blue sheet of hammered steel. No landmarks, no islands, no reference points of any kind. 38 P-47N. Thunderbolts flew southeast at 12,000 feet in a loose formation that spread across nearly 2 miles of sky. Some trailed thin lines of smoke from battle damage. Others showed holes in their wings and fuselages where Japanese bullets had punched through aluminum skin. Every pilot monitored the same instrument with the same quiet dread. The fuel gauge. Perdomo trimmed his aircraft with the precision of a man whose life depended on fractions. Throttle pulled back to minimum cruise power. Propeller pitch adjusted for maximum efficiency. Fuel mixture leaned until the engine ran just above the point where it would cough and quit. Every adjustment saved a few gallons. Every gallon meant another 15 miles of range. The mathematics were unforgiving. The P-47N burned approximately 150 gallons per hour at cruise power. Combat had consumed fuel at 3 times that rate. The external drop tanks, each carrying 165 gallons, had been jettisoned before the engagement. Perdomo was running on internal fuel only, and the needle was dropping faster than he wanted to calculate. Radio chatter was minimal. Pilots did not waste words over the ocean. Squadron leaders conducted periodic check-ins, counting voices confirming that aircraft were still flying. The absence of a response meant one of 2 things: radio failure or a ditched aircraft somewhere in the water below. Nobody wanted to think about the second option. A pilot who went into the East China Sea had a life expectancy measured in hours, not days. Water temperature was survivable, but the distances were impossible. No rescue submarines were positioned along the route. No flying boats patrolled this stretch of ocean. A man floating in a life raft 700 miles from the nearest land was, for all practical purposes, already dead. 2 hours into the return flight, Okinawa appeared as a smudge on the southern horizon. The formation began to descend. Ieshima materialized through the haze, a flat coral pancake barely large enough to hold 3 fighter groups and the thousands of support personnel who kept them flying. The island carried its own ghosts. Ernie Pyle, the most beloved war correspondent in America, had been killed there 4 months earlier by a Japanese machine gun bullet during the invasion. His grave marker still stood near the beach, where Marines had waded ashore through chest-deep water and withering fire. Now that same island served as an unsinkable aircraft carrier, launching missions against a dying empire day after day. Perdomo's fuel gauges showed nearly empty as the coral runway filled his windscreen. Other pilots reported identical numbers. The mission had pushed the P-47N to its absolute operational limit. Another 50 miles would have meant ditched aircraft and dead Americans floating in the East China Sea. One by one, the Thunderbolts entered the pattern. Wheels down. Flaps extended. Final approach over the beach where Ernie Pyle had fallen. Perdomo touched down and felt the aircraft settle onto its landing gear with a solidity that meant survival. 8 hours and 18 minutes after takeoff. Mission 507-35 was complete. He taxied to the hard stand where his crew chief waited. The man's eyes went immediately to the gun ports, checking for the dark carbon residue that indicated the weapons had been fired. He saw plenty. Then he looked at Perdomo's face and understood that something extraordinary had happened. The debriefing room was chaos organized into rows of metal folding chairs. Pilots still wearing sweat-soaked flight suits crowded around intelligence officers, who moved between them with clipboards and pencils, collecting initial combat reports, asking questions, cross-referencing claims against each other. The smell of aviation fuel and cordite hung in the air like a physical presence. 20 Japanese aircraft destroyed. The number seemed almost too large to be real, but 38 pilots had witnessed the battle, and their accounts corroborated each other with the kind of consistency that made intelligence officers stop asking questions and start writing citations. Perdomo sat in his chair and recounted the morning in a flat, exhausted voice. 5 enemy aircraft, 4 Ki-84 Frank fighters, and 1 K-5Y Willow biplane trainer. The intelligence officer wrote everything down without visible reaction, his pencil moving steadily across the standard form. Initial claims would be filed immediately. Confirmation would wait for the gun camera footage. And that footage was about to become the most scrutinized film in the 57th Fighter Group's brief combat history. The gun camera technicians processed the film that evening. They threaded the reels into projectors in a darkened room and watched August 13th unfold frame by frame. Perdomo's camera had captured everything with mechanical indifference. The first Ki-84 taking hits across its engine, cowling fire erupting from ruptured fuel lines, the aircraft rolling into its death spiral. The second Frank disintegrating under concentrated fire, pieces of wing and tail tumbling away like confetti made of aluminum. The Willow trainer catching fire against the Korean landscape, a canvas-covered anachronism burning in 3 seconds flat. The fourth, kill the ambusher who became the ambushed, exploding so close to Perdomo's aircraft that burning debris filled the frame. And then, the fifth engagement. This was where the intelligence officers leaned forward. Perdomo's camera showed the damaged Ki-84 trailing smoke. It showed the pursuit, the desperate maneuvering of an unarmed Thunderbolt, chasing an armed enemy through turns and dives that would have killed a lesser pilot. It showed empty guns pointed at a fighter whose pilot believed every second could be his last. But the killing burst, the final concentrated barrage that tore the Ki-84 apart, came from another pilot's guns. Standard procedure awarded credit based on who inflicted lethal damage. By that strict measure, the fifth kill belonged to someone else. They gave it to Perdomo anyway. The reasoning was straightforward and impossible to argue with. Without his initial attack, the Ki-84 would have destroyed the American Thunderbolt it had been pursuing. Without his pursuit, the damaged Japanese fighter would have escaped into the clouds. Without his willingness to charge an armed enemy with an empty aircraft to play aerial chicken at a combined closing speed of 800 miles per hour with nothing but nerve and bluff, the engagement would never have happened. The fifth kill was a team effort, but Oscar Perdomo had made it possible through an act of individual courage that the gun camera documented in undeniable clarity. 5 confirmed victories in a single day. ace in a day. The designation placed him alongside names that already occupied permanent positions in the history of aerial combat. Chuck Yeager had done it over Europe. Pappy Boyington had done it in the Pacific. Now, Oscar Perdomo, the son of a man who had ridden with Pancho Villa, the kid who had stacked milk crates in a Los Angeles warehouse, stood among them. Fewer than 50 American pilots had achieved the same feat during the entire war. And Perdomo had done it on what turned out to be one of the last days it was even possible to accomplish. The 57th Fighter Group's performance on August 13th earned results that made headquarters officers reach for superlatives. 20 enemy aircraft destroyed against 0 American losses. A kill ratio of 20-0. The most lopsided aerial victory of the Pacific War's final month. The entire group would receive a Presidential Unit Citation, the highest honor awarded to a military unit, recognizing extraordinary heroism in action against an armed enemy. Individual awards followed. Perdomo's Distinguished Service Cross Citation arrived with language that read like poetry filtered through a bureaucratic typewriter. Extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations against an armed enemy. The second highest award for valor the United States Army could bestow, surpassed only by the Medal of Honor. The Air Medal with Oak Leaf Cluster followed. Then, additional recognition that accumulated in folders and filing cabinets official documentation of 6 minutes of violence over Korea that had changed one man's trajectory forever. But the awards were still being processed when the world changed. The next morning, August 14th, the 57th prepared for another mission. Pilots checked their aircraft. Crew chiefs loaded ammunition belts into wing bays. Intelligence officers briefed targets. The routine of war continued because nobody had told them it was over. Then the radio crackled with words that every American on Iwo had dreamed of hearing for nearly 4 years. Emperor Hirohito had announced Japan's surrender. The atomic bombs that had fallen on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the firestorms that had erased 2 cities and killed over 100,000 people in seconds, had accomplished what years of conventional bombing and island hopping had not. The Japanese government had chosen capitulation over annihilation. The invasion that military planners had grimly projected would cost 1 million Allied casualties would never happen. The kamikaze attacks that had terrorized the Navy would cease. The aircraft, hidden in caves and tunnels across the home islands, would never fly their final missions. The war was over. Oscar Perdomo would never fly another combat mission. His 5 kills on August 13th would stand as the final ace-in-a-day achievement in United States military history. The record had been set with less than 48 hours to spare. 2 days after the surrender announcement, Perdomo witnessed something that few American combat pilots ever saw. Japanese aircraft approaching Iwo, not to attack, not to fight, to surrender. Mitsubishi G4M. Betty bombers painted entirely white, their red rising sun insignia replaced with green crosses, carried the first Japanese representatives to coordinate their nation's capitulation. The same airfield that had launched Perdomo toward his 5 kills now received the enemy delegation. He watched the white bombers touch down, watched Japanese officers emerge in formal uniforms, watched the beginning of the end with the same eyes that had tracked Kai 84 Franks through his gun sight 48 hours earlier. The juxtaposition was almost impossible to process. Men who flew aircraft identical to the ones he had destroyed were now stepping onto his runway carrying documents of surrender instead of bombs. The same sky that had been filled with tracers and burning fighters was now empty and quiet. The 57th remained on Iwo through the fall of 1945 as combat missions gave way to occupation duties. Pilots flew patrols over a defeated Japan, watching for resistance that never came. The empire that had controlled a third of the Pacific, that had built an army of 4 million soldiers and a navy that rivaled any in the world, collapsed with a signature on a piece of paper aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on September 2, 1945. The guns fell silent across the Pacific. The meat chopper had earned its name just in time. In January 1946, the group transferred to Okinawa. 4 months later, it was deactivated entirely. Oscar Perdomo's war had ended, but his story was far from over. He remained in the Army Air Forces after demobilization, one of the few wartime pilots retained for peacetime service. When the Air Force became an independent branch in 1947, Perdomo transferred to the new service. He flew jets instead of propeller fighters. The technology evolved beyond recognition, but the fundamental skills remained unchanged. Stick and rudder, eyes outside the cockpit, the instincts that had kept him alive when 4 enemy fighters dove on him out of the sun. He left active duty in January 1950, returned to civilian life in Los Angeles, joined the Air Force Reserve. His son Kenneth was 5 years old, no longer the diapered baby depicted on the nose of Lil Mayo's meat chopper. The transition to peacetime seemed complete. A decorated veteran building a quiet life far from the violence that had defined his finest hour. Then, North Korea crossed the 38th parallel. June 1950. 5 years after Oscar Perdomo had shot down 5 aircraft over the Korean peninsula, war returned to the exact same territory. The United States mobilized rapidly, recalling reservists, activating units. Captain Oscar Perdomo reported for active duty on June 30, 1950. The man who had become the last ace in a day over Korea was going back to the peninsula where he had made history. He flew F-84 Thunderjets and F-86 Sabres during his second war. No nose art this time. No pictures of babies with cigars and derby hats. Kenneth was a teenager now, too old for that kind of tribute. Perdomo flew training missions, qualified new pilots, helped build the force that would fight communist MiGs over the Yalu River. In February 1955, his skills saved lives one final time. Flying a T-33 trainer with a student in the rear seat, his aircraft developed a catastrophic fuel leak. Gasoline fumes filled the cockpit, burning his eyes until he could barely see the instrument panel. Most pilots would have ejected. Perdomo stayed with the aircraft, executed a dead-stick landing without engine power, and brought both himself and his student safely to the ground. He retired from the Air Force in January 1958 with the rank of Major. 20 years of service. 2 wars. 5 kills in a single day. A career that most fighter pilots could only imagine. The man who had charged Japanese fighters with empty guns finally stopped flying. Oscar Perdomo settled into civilian life in Los Angeles with his family, his medals and memories of a morning over Korea that grew sharper instead of fading with time. But the story of Oscar Perdomo has one final chapter. A chapter that proves the cruelest truth about war, that it does not end when the shooting stops, that it follows you home, that it reaches into the next generation with hands that no amount of heroism can stop. The baby on the nose of Lil Mayo's meat chopper, the infant who had inspired the name of the most famous P-47N in the Pacific, grew up in a nation that could not stop sending its sons to fight in distant countries. And what happened to that boy? What Vietnam did to the Perdomo family, and how the last ace in a day met his own end, that is where this story concludes. In Part 4, a milk crate stacker from East Los Angeles with 0 kills flew 9 empty missions over the Pacific. On the 10th, he destroyed 5 Japanese aircraft in 6 minutes, bluffed a 6th with empty guns, and became the last ace in a day in United States military history. He survived the 8-hour flight home on fumes. He watched white-painted Japanese bombers land on his airfield, carrying surrender documents instead of bombs. He earned the Distinguished Service Cross the Air Medal and a Presidential Unit Citation. He flew jets in a second war over the same Korean peninsula where he had made history. He saved a student pilot's life by landing a fuel-leaking trainer without engine power. He retired as a major with 20 years of service and 2 wars behind him. That is where we left Oscar Perdomo at the end of Part 3. A decorated hero settling into civilian life in Los Angeles with his wife, his children, and memories of a morning over Korea that the gun camera had preserved in undeniable black and white. But this story has a final twist that no amount of heroism could prevent, because the baby on the nose of Lil Mayo's meat chopper grew up, and the war that Oscar Perdomo survived found his son instead. Kenneth Perdomo was 5 years old when his father came home from the Pacific. The boy had existed for the first years of his life as a painting on the nose of a 7-ton fighter aircraft, a chubby infant chomping a cigar and wearing a derby hat, clutching a tiny rifle in hands that had never held anything heavier than a bottle. Oscar Perdomo had carried that image across 1,500 miles of ocean and through 6 minutes of the most intense aerial combat of the Pacific War's final month. The painted baby had grinned through every burst of .50 caliber fire, every diving attack, every moment when the mathematics of fuel and distance and ammunition threatened to kill the man who had named his aircraft after his son. Now the real Kenneth was growing up in Los Angeles, learning to ride a bicycle, attending school, living the ordinary American childhood that his father had fought to make possible. Oscar settled into the rhythms of peacetime with the quiet determination of a man who understood exactly what peace cost. He did not talk much about the war. Veterans of that generation rarely did. The memories lived in a sealed compartment, opened occasionally at reunions or veterans' gatherings, where men who had shared the same skies could speak a language their families would never fully understand. The Korean War pulled him back. The second conflict over the same peninsula, where he had earned his place in history, must have carried a strange resonance for Oscar Perdomo. Flying F-84, Thunderjets, and F-86 Sabres over terrain, he had last seen through the gun sight of a P-47 Thunderbolt. Training new pilots who were younger than his combat experience. Building the force that would fight MiG-15s in the world's first jet-versus-jet air war. He served with distinction, added years to his record, and returned home again. The fuel leak incident in 1955, when he landed a crippled T-33 trainer with gasoline fumes burning his eyes and a student pilot's life in his hands, was the last entry in a flying career that had begun with milk crates and ended with a major's oak leaves. January 1958. Retirement. 20 years of service completed. The man who had charged armed enemies with an empty aircraft finally stopped flying. The years that followed should have been quiet. Oscar Perdomo had earned quiet. He had a home in Los Angeles. He had his family. He had a story that belonged in the history books, even if most of those books had not yet been written. But America in the 1960s was not a quiet place, and the war that had defined Oscar Perdomo's generation was about to reach forward through time and destroy the thing he loved most. Specialist 4th Class Chris Mitchell Perdomo served as a door gunner on a UH-1 Iroquois helicopter in South Vietnam. The boy whose infant face had decorated the nose of Lil Mayo's meat chopper, the baby with the painted cigar and the tilted derby hat, had grown into a young man who flew into combat zones, just as his father had done 25 years earlier. Different war, different aircraft, different enemy, but the same sky, the same mathematics of survival, the same terrible lottery that decided which men came home and which did not. On May 5, 1970, Chris Mitchell Perdomo's helicopter crashed and exploded 5 miles southwest of Phu Vinh in South Vietnam. He was one of 3 crew members killed. The baby on the nose art was gone. The son that Oscar Perdomo had crossed 1,500 miles of ocean to come home to the child whose painted image had grinned through tracers and fireballs and the desperate bluff of an unarmed fighter charging an armed enemy, was dead at the age most young men are just beginning to understand what their lives might become. The loss broke Oscar Perdomo in a way that 4 key 84 Franks diving out of the sun never could. He had survived Japanese fighters. He had survived empty guns and impossible fuel calculations and dead stick landings. He had survived 2 wars that killed millions of men who were no less brave and no less deserving of survival than he was. But he could not survive the death of his son. The man who had never flinched, who had turned into attacking formations when every instinct screamed to run, who had bluffed armed enemies with nothing but nerve and an empty aircraft began drinking. The alcohol consumed him with the same methodical thoroughness that 50 caliber rounds had consumed Japanese fighters over Korea. There was no gun camera to document this destruction, no intelligence officers to review the footage, no medals awarded for the slow private annihilation of a man who had once been invincible in the sky. Major Oscar Francis Perdomo died on March 2, 1976, in Los Angeles. He was 56 years old. His family honored his final request and scattered his ashes over the Pacific Ocean, the same waters he had crossed so many times during the war, the same endless gray-blue expanse that had separated him from his son and his home on that August morning in 1945. The last ace in a day returned to the sky one final time. But the legacy Oscar Perdomo left behind extends far beyond medals in shadow boxes and ashes on the Pacific wind. The P-47 Thunderbolt that carried him into history represented the pinnacle of a design philosophy that would influence military aviation for decades. Republic Aviation's concept of the fighter bomber, an aircraft that combined devastating firepower with the range to project that firepower across vast distances, became the template for an entire generation of American combat aircraft. The F-84 Thunderjet that Perdomo flew in Korea was a direct descendant of the Thunderbolt philosophy. The F-105 Thunderchief that bore the brunt of the air war over North Vietnam carried the same Republic Aviation DNA. Even the A-10 Thunderbolt II, the legendary Warthog that has served the United States Air Force since the 1970s, inherited its name and its mission from the aircraft that Oscar Perdomo flew over Korea. The idea that a single aircraft could carry enough firepower to destroy armored vehicles, fortified positions, and enemy aircraft while possessing the range and durability to survive deep penetration missions traces a direct line from the P-47 to the combat aircraft flying today. 8 machine guns became rotary cannons. Piston engines became turbofans. But the fundamental equation firepower plus range plus survivability remained unchanged. The concept of the ace in a day 5 kills in a single engagement belongs to an era of warfare that will almost certainly never return. Modern air combat operates at speeds and distances that make the swirling dogfights of World War II physically impossible. A fighter pilot today may fire a missile at a target 60 miles away and never see the aircraft he destroys. The intimacy of Perdomo's combat, close enough to see the individual panels of an enemy aircraft's skin rippling under bullet impacts close enough to watch a pilot's canopy shatter, belongs to a period when aerial warfare was still conducted within the range of human vision and human reflexes. Perdomo's 5 kills were confirmed by gun camera footage, the definitive standard of verification in an era before radar tracking and electronic warfare systems made such things unnecessary. That footage still exists, preserved in military archives, showing in grainy black and white exactly what happened over Korea on August 13, 1945. No modern pilot will ever replicate what Oscar Perdomo accomplished because the technology of aerial combat has evolved beyond the point where such achievements are possible. His record is not just unbroken, it is unbreakable. The broader lesson of Oscar Perdomo's story is not about technology or tactics or the mathematics of aerial combat. It is about the distance between what a person appears to be and what a person is capable of becoming when circumstances demand everything they have. A milk crate stacker, a son of Mexican immigrants, a man whose father had ridden with Pancho Villa and crossed the border with nothing. 9 missions of empty skies that produced zero evidence of the extraordinary pilot hiding inside an ordinary exterior. The military establishment, like every large institution, excels at measuring what has already happened and struggles to predict what might happen next. Oscar Perdomo's 9 empty missions told his commanders nothing about what he would do when 50 Japanese aircraft finally rose to meet him. His personnel file contained no hint that the quiet kid from East Los Angeles possessed the reflexes, the aggression, the cold, mathematical precision, and the almost insane courage that would produce 5 kills in 6 minutes, and a bluff that still astonishes military historians 80 years later. history is filled with similar patterns. The innovations that changed the course of World War II came overwhelmingly from people that institutional wisdom would have overlooked. Barnes Wallis was a middle-aged airship designer when he invented the bouncing bomb that destroyed the Ruhr dams. Percy Spencer was a self-taught engineer with no college degree when he accidentally discovered microwave cooking while working on military radar systems. Alan Turing was an eccentric mathematician whom the British military establishment regarded with suspicion and discomfort, even as his code-breaking work at Bletchley Park shortened the war by an estimated 2 years and saved 14 million lives. The pattern repeats because institutions reward predictability, and extraordinary achievement is by definition unpredictable. Oscar Perdomo stacking milk crates in a Los Angeles warehouse was invisible to the system. Oscar Perdomo diving on 4 Ki-84 Franks with 8 blazing machine guns was the system's most lethal weapon. And there is one final detail that most people who hear this story never learn. A detail that closes the circle in a way that feels almost too perfect to be true. The Commemorative Air Force maintains a flying P-47 Thunderbolt restored to the exact configuration and paint scheme of Lil Mayo's meat chopper. The nose art shows the same baby, the same oversized cigar, the same derby hat tilted at the same rakish angle, the same tiny rifle clutched in the same pudgy hands. That aircraft flies at air shows across the United States, introducing new generations to the story of a pilot who accomplished something that will never be repeated. Children who were not born until decades after World War II ended stand on tarmac and stare up at the painted baby on the nose of a 7-ton fighter, and hear about the morning a nobody from East Los Angeles became somebody in 6 minutes of concentrated violence over Korea. They hear about the 5 kills. They hear about the empty guns. They hear about the bluff. What they do not hear, what the air show announcers rarely mention, is that the baby on the nose grew up to become a door gunner in Vietnam and died in a helicopter crash 5 miles southwest of Phu Vinh on May 5, 1970. The painted grin that had survived tracers and fireballs and the entire Pacific War could not protect the real child it represented. The nose art outlived the boy it depicted. The aircraft outlived the pilot who named it. And the story preserved in gun camera footage and military archives and the fading memories of men who were there outlived them all. From a milk crate warehouse in East Los Angeles to the skies over Korea, Oscar Perdomo proved that the most dangerous weapon in any military arsenal is not a machine gun or a fighter aircraft or an atomic bomb. It is a human being who refuses to accept the limitations that the world has assigned to him. 26 years old, son of immigrants, 9 missions of nothing. And then in 6 minutes, that the gun camera captured frame by frame, he destroyed 5 enemy aircraft, became an ace, charged a 6th with empty guns on nothing but nerve, and earned a place in history that 80 years of jet-age combat have failed to duplicate. 5 kills, 0 ammunition remaining, 750 miles from home. The meat chopper earned its name that morning over Korea. Oscar Perdomo earned something more. He earned proof documented in black and white film that does not lie, that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary things when the moment demands it, and they choose not to look away. If this story stayed with you, if you felt something watching a man charge an armed enemy with an empty aircraft, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment and tell us where you are watching from. Tell us if someone in your family served. Tell us if you had ever heard the name Oscar Perdomo before today. Subscribe if you want more stories, like this one, stories about people history forgot and the moments that proved history was wrong to forget them. We pull these stories from dusty archives every single week because someone has to. August 13th, 1945. 48 hours before the end of the deadliest war in human history. 1 pilot from East Los Angeles. 1 aircraft named after a baby boy who would never grow old. And 6 minutes that proved the most dangerous thing in the sky is not the plane with the most guns. It is the pilot who does not know he is supposed to lose.